because also I believe that it is according to God's will that the white race, which is in the majority in this country, should be preserved.
South African police are investigating a deadly taxi shooting in KwaZulu-Natal at the weekend.
To understand how the taxi mafia became so brutally violent, you need to understand where they came from. Between 1948 and 1994, South Africa was governed by an all-white apartheid government.
Policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid.
Apartheid, which means apartness in Afrikaans, was basically the South African version of segregation, just more brutally enforced. White people were completely separated from non-white people.
Accepting that there are differences between people.
They didn't shop in the same stores, live in the same neighborhoods, or use the same public transport. The two main political parties that opposed the White National Party was called the Inkatha Freedom Party and the African National Congress, or ANC. These two groups were outlawed during apartheid, but they still worked illegally to get support for the liberation movement. And inside these two separate groups, black people from different tribes or regions of the country, like Zulu, Xhosa, Bapti, were forced to work together even though they didn't always want to, which obviously led to a lot of fighting and even more violence. Also segregated was the taxi industry, where taxis owned and operated by non-whites was pretty much non-existent, or so the government thought. As this underground taxi industry grew in South Africa, most drivers and associations would eventually become affiliated with either political parties for protection. Before 1987, the taxi industry in South Africa was highly regulated and tightly controlled. You needed a permit to operate a taxi under South African law, but permits were almost impossible to get as a black taxi owner or driver. But that didn't stop black entrepreneurs from operating taxis though. And even though it was illegal, a lot of these taxi drivers banded together to form small local associations. Then in 1979, the first real taxi association was started, the South African Black Taxi Association, or SABTA. Just a few years later, a rival association was formed, called the South African Long Distance Taxi Association, or SALDTA. With more and more political pressure being placed on the apartheid government, calls for deregulation, and the illegal taxis becoming more involved in the anti-apartheid political parties, the government eventually decided that trying to control the taxi industry wasn't worth the trouble. According to them, it had gotten too politicized, and that allowing black drivers into the industry would support the economy. But as always, there was a secret agenda, and the taxi industry was deregulated overnight. In 1987 and 88, a law with this giant name deregulated the entire taxi industry in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, black taxi owners could apply for permits to transport passengers, and you can imagine what happened next. Anyone with a dream to make it big and get rich wanted to get involved in this new legal business. Thousands and thousands of people rushed to get permits and started planning their routes. The only problem was, the deregulation happened overnight. So suddenly the permit offices were overcrowded. People were waiting months to get their paperwork approved. And eventually the only way to get your permit was to bribe the guy who was in charge. Permits were issued like confetti. And becoming a taxi driver was as simple as buying a taxi and a gun. With so many people flooding in, competition obviously grew insanely quickly. And competition without a stable justice system was the perfect recipe for violence. Taxi wars. All the while, the government stood by doing nothing. And that wasn't a coincidence. That secret agenda we talked about earlier, it was now fully in play. As was typical for the apartheid government, they found a new way to sow discord. By leaving the taxi unions to destroy each other, the security services wouldn't have to. And it worked. The taxi wars that broke out after deregulation killed many liberation leaders, and deepened the divides between the ethnic groups that were once part of the same political movements. For a while, it looked like the National Party's plan to slow down the revolutionary movement had worked, but then came discussions to end apartheid, and with this, everyone expected the violence to end. Big mistake.